It's 7 lines down. New case. So this fellow says to his wife, he says, I'm going to give all my possessions to whatever you're pregnant with, right? Up until this point, we're having kind of conversations about giving money to his son this much and daughter to this much. Now he says to his wife, I'm going to give all my possessions, whatever our child is. So Amar Rav Huna, having mezakeh le'uber. So Rav Huna says there's a problem with this. Because what you're doing is giving your possessions to a unborn child, a fetus. And if you transfer anything to a fetus can't acquire. What's the problem? So this is what we were discussing we started to discuss yesterday, that in order to make an acquisition, you need to be able to have somebody who has the possession, who is acquiring, and then you have to have somebody on the receiving end who can receive. Rav Huna holds an uber is not a person yet. They're not born yet, so they can't do a receiving action. They cannot receive the item. So therefore, this transaction isn't effective. Okay, so Eisvei Rav Nachman le Rav Huna. So Rav Nachman asked Rav Huna. We're going to see that Rav Nachman doesn't agree with Rav Huna on that position. That's going to be he's going to challenge that position. But Rav Nachman asks Rav Huna, and he says, Ha'omer im yolda ishti zachar yitomana yolda zachar notomana. He says Rav Nachman says to Rav Huna, he says, wait a second. We had our Mishnah that we learned yesterday. The Mishnah said that the fellow says, if I have a son, I'm going to give him 100. If I have a daughter, right? So then I'm going to give 200. Well, what's happening there? You're going to give, if I have a son, he's going to get 100. So sounds like it's exactly the same case. Rav Huna, you just said the fetus can't acquire. How come that works? Right? How come the Mishnah says that works? So Amar Le, so Rav Huna answered back, Mishnah Seinu, Eini Yodeya Mishan Ah. He says, I don't know whose opinion that is. Right? But what Rav Huna is saying there is that the Mishnah doesn't represent the prevailing viewpoint. It represents an individual viewpoint. I just don't know who it is. But that's not the prevailing viewpoint. That's Rav Huna's point of view. Okay. Now, the question we're going to propose, what we're going to do for the next page or so, is that we're going to propose many different solutions that Rav Huna could have answered. Why is it that it should have been effective? So, V'lei molei Rabbi Meir. Well, why is it that Rav Huna didn't answer that our Mishnah follows Rabbi Meir's point of view? Now, we don't follow Rabbi Meir's point of view, but we describe Rabbi Meir's point of view is that davar shelo, that a person can acquire davar shelo baliolam, something that doesn't exist. Now, the case that Rabbi Meir is usually talking about an object that doesn't exist is where, let's say, for example, a person wants to sell fruit from a tree. Okay, so ideally, the fruit should exist before you sell it. What if you have the tree, but you don't have the fruit yet? It hasn't grown yet. So that's davar shelo baliolam. The item that I'm trying to sell doesn't exist yet. I have a likelihood to believe that it could exist in the future, but it doesn't exist right now today. Can I sell? This is essentially the futures market, right? That's what this futures market is. I'm selling you something that does not exist. So you can't sell it. That's what, except according to Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir holds that you can sell something based on what's coming down the road. Okay? Da'amar, that he holds, he holds that you can create a transference of something that has not come into the world yet. So, why doesn't Rav Huna answer that? Right? Rav Huna said, I don't know, but Rabbi Meir's opinion is certainly well known. Right? We're going to see, as we learned in Gemara, we're going to see Rabbi Meir say this many, many times throughout the Gemara. So certainly, Rav Huna was aware. Why is it that Rav Huna didn't give that as an explanation? That's where Mishnah is. That even though the child doesn't exist yet, since the child will in the future exist, he can acquire it.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking of Shmuel HaNavi. Before he was born, the mother made Al Tanai.
Okay, so that's good, right? So you could, we also have Shimshon, right? Who's a Nazir, right? And they make all kinds of, but that's not an acquisition, right? These are acquisitions. He's not acquiring anything. He's pledging that when my child will be born, I will do such and such with my child, right? That's a pledge. That's not an acquisition. He's not transferring. He's not saying that my child now currently becomes, that unborn child now becomes the current owner of such and such. That wasn't the case by Shmuel, and it wasn't the case by Shimshon either. Okay? So, Eimer deshmasle l'Rebbe Meir l'davar sheyeshno ba'olam. L'davar she'eno ba'olam mishmasle. He says, yeah, but there's a big difference. When Rabbi Meir said that you can transfer something that doesn't exist in the world, that's when the object that you're transferring doesn't yet exist, right? The fruit on the tree hasn't grown yet. But you and I, who are making the transaction, we exist, right? I'm the seller, you're the buyer. We're making a transaction. The object doesn't exist. But when one of the people in the transaction doesn't exist, that's different, right? The object exists, the father exists, the person who's trying to receive the gift, the baby, that baby doesn't exist yet, right? Baby's not born yet. That's not the same thing. Those are not parallel cases, right? We see the distinction? So that's why he didn't want to say it was Rabbi Meir's opinion. Okay.
So it's not the traded item that doesn't exist. It's the person
one of the, that's correct. So that's very different. So that's where Meir's different. Okay. So that didn't work. So we'll try again. We'll try another opinion. V'leimale Rabbi Yossi. So Da'omar Uber Koni. He says, but what about maybe it's Rabbi Yossi? Rabbi Yossi explicitly has the opinion that an unborn fetus can acquire an object. How do we know he holds that way? We have a Mishnah that says, Uber posel ve'eno ma'achil. We have a case where a Kohen has a wife, okay? She is not a Kohen. She's not the daughter of a Kohen, okay? So she's a Yisraelis. A Kohen marries a Yisraelis. So a Kohen, the halacha is, he can eat truma, right? This is the gifts that when a farmer grows his product, he gives a portion of it, 1/40th, 1/50th, or 1/60th, depending on how generous he is, to the Kohen, okay? The Kohen himself can eat it, because the Torah says he can. Not only can he eat it, but all of his household can eat it as well. Members of his household being his wife. Of course, his children can. They're Kohanim themselves. The sons are Kohanim themselves. The daughters who are unmarried are also part of his household. And any slaves or any other possessions, human beings who are in his possessions, in his household, can also eat the truma as well. Okay, so what happens if the Kohen has a wife who's not a Kohen herself? She wouldn't be allowed to eat truma if it weren't for her husband. Now she's pregnant, the husband dies. Okay, so now, if she already had a baby, the halacha would be if she already had a baby, so now she has a son who's a Kohen, she can continue to eat truma because she's already part of the Kohen household. And even though her husband is not around anymore, since she has a baby who's a Kohen, her son is a Kohen, can enable her to continue to eat truma. If, however, she doesn't have any children, so she can't continue to eat truma. So now she has this unborn child. So says Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi says, Uber posel ve'eno machli. The Uber is very interesting. The Uber, he makes it so that all of the father's household slaves, the possessions, the people that the father owns, cannot eat truma, and he doesn't enable his mother to eat truma. Now, what's going on? If the child is a Kohen, so then the child would be able to enable the mother to eat truma. So what we're holding is that until the child is going to receive the status of being a Kohen at birth. Prior to being born, it's almost like we had like the Bechorah yesterday. When the animal is born, then the animal gets the sanctity of being a Bechorah. A fetus in the mother is not yet a Kohen, right? Unborn child, not yet a Kohen. Once the child is born, and the halacha is that even if it's a C-section and it's not a normal birth, the child becomes a Kohen. But until the child's alive, the child is not a Kohen. Not only, therefore, is the child not a Kohen, but Rabbi Yossi goes one step further. Rabbi Yossi goes one step further, and he says the rest of the household can't eat truma as well. Now, we understand the mother, without a living child who's a Kohen, she can't eat truma. But all of the slaves, all of the possessions, what is the reason why they can't eat truma? The answer is because the child who inherits the father now owns them. And as the result of the child who is now the possession of the father, now the child owns the slaves, those slaves cannot eat truma because the child is not a Kohen.
Wait, the child's not born yet, so he doesn't exist. He's not.
Oh, so this is our proof. If the child was born yet doesn't exist, then the child can't acquire these slaves. The child is not the owner of the slaves. Now, what happens here is that there are other children in the family, right? So there could be other sons here. They're Kohanim. So therefore, if the child doesn't exist, then the slaves go to the other Kohanim, the other sons that are Kohanim. The slaves can go on eating truma. However, if even one of the brothers is not a Kohen, so then the slaves are part owned by Kohanim and part owned by non-Kohanim. A slave that is part owned by Kohanim, part owned by non-Kohanim cannot eat truma.
I don't understand it because it seems to be a contradiction.
Yeah.
At one point you're saying he can't be a Kohen because
he's not alive yet, right?
But then you're saying at the same point nobody could eat truma because a non-Cohen, which is only a non-Cohen because of
He's a non-Kohen because he's not
Right.
born yet. But Rabbi Yossi is of the opinion that even though he's not born, he can acquire. And that is very nice because that's what we're looking for such an opinion.
Would that be considered Maris Ayin, though?
Maris Ayin, because why? What's the Maris Ayin? What are we seeing that we shouldn't be seeing?
Because with the slaves, they'd be eating with Truma.
So in this case, they weren't eating the truma, but it's the opposite. The slaves are not eating the truma, right? Because they're told they can't.
But I'm confused because don't they go together? Like either it's A and
Yes.
he's a Kohen and they can eat truma, or it's B and he's not Kohen and they should be able to eat truma anyways because he can't.
And that's what we should be expecting,
Right.
except for the fact that we're seeing not like that. And this is Rabbi Yossi's opinion, which shows us that Rabbi Yossi is of a unique opinion, which is that even though he's not born, he can acquire goods, which is great because that's the opinion we've been looking for. Our Mishnah, which talks about transferring ownership of 100 zuz over to the unborn fetus, must be Rabbi Yossi because he's the guy who holds you could transfer to an unborn fetus. So that's very good. So why didn't Rav Huna answer that? Right, Rav Huna, again, he said, I don't know who it is. Why didn't he answer? It's Rabbi Yossi. The answer is no. Shani Yerusha haba me'aleha. He says, it's different. Even Rabbi Yossi only agrees that you can transfer possessions to a fetus when it is an inheritance. Why? Because inheritance happens by itself. In a normal transaction, you need somebody to say, here, I'm giving this to you. And then you need somebody saying, great, I will be on the receiving end. When it comes to Yerusha, the person just has to die. When he dies, the transference automatically begins. And that transference, because it can happen without even somebody starting the transaction, may be even a stronger transaction such that even an unborn child can be on the receiving end of that transaction. So even Rabbi Yossi, everybody else disagrees with Rabbi Yossi, but even Rabbi Yossi who feels that an unborn child can receive items only holds that way when it comes to inheritance. He doesn't hold that that is the case when it comes to a gift. So therefore, our Mishnah, which is a gift, can't be Rabbi Yossi. So that explains why Rav Huna doesn't answer Rabbi Yossi. Okay, we'll try again. Let's try another one. Okay, V'lema le Rabbi Yochanan ben Brokahi. Maybe it could be Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. Here's what Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says: Damar loshna Yerusha v'loshna matana. He does not make any distinction between transferences of inheritance and transferences of gifts. How so? T'tanan, we have a Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says, Im Amar al Misha Roy Liyorsho Divorov Kayamin. So let's say somebody decides he wants to transfer his goods to somebody who is who is not the main heir. He doesn't want to give the inheritance the normal way. He doesn't want it split up evenly amongst his sons. He likes one of his sons best. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says, if you make a decision that you want to transfer your inheritance to one of your sons instead of everybody else, you could do that. Then it's considered an inheritance. The only thing is, the person you're doing that transference to has to be one of the heirs. Meaning you can't go take somebody from the street and say, I'm going to give it to my friend Joe. Yeah, you can give it as a gift. But I can't cause my friend Joe to inherit me over these real heirs that are in front of me. But Rabbi Yochanan Broka says I can say, my third son, I'm going to give him everything and skip over my other sons.
I thought you can't. I thought there's a pasuk in the comment.
Yeah, but
it says you can't do that. Like if you have a son
by the Bechor, yes, right.
It's only applies to
the Bechor. That is correct. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka has his own shita on this. This is his own point of view. And the Gemara in the last paragraph discussed how he learns all of those different psukim. But yes, this is Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka's own opinion. Now, the way that we are learning Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka is, it doesn't sound like he makes any distinction whether the child who he's selecting is born or not born. So therefore, maybe he allows you to skip over your born children and give your possessions to your unborn child. So they say, no, that's not what Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says. Amar dishmasle the Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, the davar sheyishno ba'olam. Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka says you can pick one of your sons over the others. That's when all of them are living, right? L'davar she'eno ba'olam mi amar, but he doesn't say that you can pick a son that wasn't born yet, who doesn't exist in the world yet. That he doesn't do. Okay, well, we've got a solution for that. We can combine two people together. V'leimale, Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, the savar like Rabbi Yossi. Maybe it's Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, which means you can pick one of the sons. And he also holds like Rabbi Yossi, who holds that you can transfer items to an unborn child. So the combination together, right? Why didn't we want to say it's Rabbi Yossi by himself? Because we wanted to say Rabbi Yossi makes a distinction between inheritance and gifts. Or Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka doesn't make a distinction between inheritance and gifts. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka is not talking about an unborn child. Well, maybe Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka holds like Rabbi Yossi, and that's our Mishnah. Yeah, but the only thing is Mar de Savarle, who says that that's true. We never find any source, any place where Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka sounds like he holds like Rabbi Yossi. So we didn't want to answer that question. Okay, but we'll try again. The lemale kemevasrani. Maybe we had a case yesterday where we talked about not giving the gift to the child himself, but what happens if the father says, I would like to give a present to somebody who gives me the good news about what kind of a child I'm going to have, a boy or a girl. So maybe that's what's happening in our Mishnah. Maybe our Mishnah isn't giving the gift to the unborn child, because you're right, maybe that's not allowed. But maybe the gift is being given to the person who's coming to tell me about the fact that my wife is going to have a male or a female. Maybe that's what this means. So ihachi, well, yeah, but if you say that that's what's going on, so then the Ketani Seifa, so then the end of the Mishnah says, V'im ein sham yoresh elahu yoresh, that the tumtum, remember we said, if he's the only heir, then he's the one who gets the gift. Well, so Ibn Vasrani, Yoresh Maya Vidite. If we're talking about giving the gift to a third party who's giving you good news, why is the end of the Mishnah talking about inheriting property to a tumtum? Are we talking about the child, which sounds like at the end of the Mishnah we're talking about the child, or are we talking about some third party that we're giving the money to? It doesn't sound like we're talking about a third party. We're talking about the child. So therefore, that explanation is no good. Okay, so we'll try again. V'leimale b'sheyolda. Maybe what he's saying is, I won't give my child, I want to give my child the money, right? He's not born yet. Can't give the child the money. Here's what I'm doing. When my child is born, I will give him $100. Okay, that's his idea. Can't give him the $100 today. He's not born. But I can promise to give him $100 later.
Right.
Okay, so does that work? So, ihachi diktani seifa. Sorry, I skipped one case ahead. This is a case of, maybe the case is, he's making this statement after the child's already born. That's what's happening here. He made the case, child's already born. He says, I'm going to give it to my born son. My son, oh, look, I've got a son. I'm going to give him 100 zuz. Maybe that's what he's saying. No. Ihachi diktani seifa. He says, yeah, but read the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't say that. It says, V'im amar kol ma sheteled ishti yitol. If it says, whatever my wife will have, so then he's going to get a gift. So then zeyitol. So then the tumtum can get a gift, right? But it says kol sheteled. Why would it say anybody who will be born, which is future tense, when you're telling me the Mishnah is talking about a child that was already born? That's kol sheyolda mibayil. It should say anybody who was already born.
Isn't somebody who's stipulating that their wife's going to have a child and not really taking consideration whatsoever that it'll be not usually beyond the...
Yes.
If it's a two-headed child, like that doesn't get into...
So that was our Mishnah, right? But if he specifies, I'm going to give my child, well, that was the Mishnah's case, right? If he says child, my child, and does not specify, then it includes tumtum. Right, it does. Then it does include tumtum. Right, I would have thought maybe not.
Maybe he's not so happy to give it to the messenger or the child in that.
Mm-hmm. Right, so maybe not. But the Mishnah says that we're going to presume that is in his thought process. Okay, so top of Kuf Mem Beis. So Kuf Mem says v'leimalei. Now I got the case in the right order. V'leimalei da'amar likisheteled. Maybe he's saying when he's born, I will give him the gift. Right. So I'm making the promise to a future acquisition. So the answer is Rav Huna l'tamei. The reason why Rav Huna can't answer that as an answer is Damar Rav Huna af likisheteled lo kana. That even if he makes such a statement that when the child is born in the future, I will give him a present, that statement also does not work. Okay? How do we know he says that? Damar Rav Nachman, and he said Rav Nachman's going to disagree. This is why Rav Nachman doesn't have a problem with the Mishnah. Maybe that's how Rav Nachman learns our Mishnah. Rav Nachman himself says, Hamazake leubar lo kona. If somebody says, I want to give it to my unborn fetus, my unborn child, that does not work. But likisheteled kona. But if he says, when he will be born, that can work. Okay? For Rav Huna Amar, Rav Huna says, Af likisheteled lo kona. Even if he says, what I will give the money, I will give it to my child when he's born, he says that doesn't work also. Now what's going on between them?
So interesting. sorry.
Right? Yep. Yeah.
No, I'm just thinking because you have to be a certain age to be able to make like I can't make a kinyan with a katan anyway.
You can. Child can receive, child cannot give.
Oh, so okay. So
Right? Right?
I didn't know.
That's why what you're thinking of is by lulav and esrog,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
You don't want to share your lulav and esrog with your child. Why? Because the pasuk says, "Ulekachtem lachem," you have to own your lulav and esrog.
Right.
So if I take my lulav and esrog and I give it to my child, he becomes the owner of the lulav and esrog. He cannot give it to anybody else.
Why did you can't afford to buy one for your child?
Then you make sure you use it first, right? You use it first and give it to your child. But once he's got it, right? So, but he can be on the receiving end, right? The child can be on the receiving end. So that's fine. But if he's not born yet, can't be on the receiving end. Can't wave a lulav and esrog either. But he can get the rest of this gift. So now, Rav Sheshis Amar, Rav Sheshis is the one who disagrees. Rav Sheshis says, Echad zeh ve'echad zeh kana. Rav Sheshis says, he's of the opinion that it doesn't matter whether the child's born or not born, the child in the womb can receive a gift. Okay? Amar Rav Sheshis, mina Allah. Rav Sheshis says, you know where my source for that? By the way, Rav Huna can't say the Mishnah goes like Rav Sheshis. Why? Because the Mishnah is written way before Rav Sheshis. Right? Rav Sheshis is an Amora. We discussed, right? The Mishnah was written first. Rav Sheshis is later Amora. Right? So you cannot, Rav Sheshis can't say the Mishnah goes like Rav Sheshis. Rav Sheshis, we're going to say the Mishnah is going to follow the Mishnah. Now Rav Sheshis is of an opinion that is an additional, his perspective, which is that a child sounds like, that like he holds like Rabbi Yossi, but even when it comes to gifts, he's like the extreme position. So where does he say, where do I know that from? Where's the source for that position? We're 6 lines down. Titania, last word on the line. Titania, Ger Shemes, Obizbazu Yisrael Nechasav. He says, let's say you have a convert. So the thing about converts is they're the only people who have no relatives. They can die if they don't have any sons. They can die without anybody, no transference of inheritance, right? So he says, so Ger Shemes Ubizbazu Yisrael Nechasav. So what happens to his property when he dies? So it becomes hefker. Anybody who takes it, it belongs to them. So what happens is a bunch of his neighbors, the Israelim or the Jewish people that are around him, they come and they take his stuff. Okay?
Say that case again.
Yep.
Where is it that it becomes hefker?
Well, you have a convert, and he has no kids.
Oh,
so there's nobody's going to inherit him.
Doesn't it cheat to the government?
Doesn't go to the No. We're not in Canada, maybe.
Yeah.
Anybody can go just take it.
And then this person
It's
has
free for all.
this person's not married. This person has no.
That's correct. If he has a wife and potentially his wife doesn't inherit him either, but his wife could take it because she's there, right?
No, but can't her craving like it goes?
There are no crows, right? If there are children, then they get it.
Doesn't inherit her husband.
Sorry, a wife never inherits from her husband. She is able to be supported from the estate, right? But the inheritance, Yerusha, passes to sons, daughters, and then to brothers, not to wives.
So even if there's no male at all.
That's right. So what happens here is this ger has no heirs. He's got no children. So therefore, the Yisrael and his neighbors come and take the possessions of the property. Now, here's what happens. They come and they collect everything. There's nothing wrong with that. Nobody's like, they're not like vultures picking whatever. It's like the image we have, like they all came running into his house and grabbed all of his stuff. It was legal, right? They all came in and they took the stuff. So now, Vishamu sheyesh lo ben. Then they heard, oh, you know what? He has a son. Okay, well, if he has a son, then the son inherited it. We had no right to take the property. So what do? So, shahaisa ishta muberis. Or maybe he had a pregnant wife. Now, interesting, this pregnant wife, the child then, right, his pregnant wife, so they have to be able to give it to the child. This is the proof that Rav Sheshis is bringing. If the child isn't born yet, who cares that he has a pregnant wife? When the ger died, the property is hefker, right? So now, what happens? What happens to the property? So the answer is chayav lahachzir. They have to give it back. They have no right to it because there was an heir. So therefore, they have to give the property back. Okay. Now, hechziru hakol. So what they did, they returned everything. Okay, it's all sitting in the house, waiting for the son to come home and inherit everything, or waiting for the child to be born. V'achar kach shamu shemes beno, and then turns out his son dies. Oh, shepila ishto, or his wife has a miscarriage. Now there's no heir. What happens? Hefker again. So they all go running back in to grab. The only thing is, maybe they don't all grab the same stuff, right? Maybe different people come in and grab it. So
No executor who manages the whole
whatever.
distribution.
No, it's ownerless, whoever comes in, right? So therefore, hechzik b'shniya kana u'berishona lo kana. Whatever the second, whoever takes stuff the second time, that is an effective collection. The first time, though, doesn't count. Whatever they took the first time doesn't count. So now, here's the issue. V'isalka daitach uber lo kani. I understand. Let's say there's a son. Why? Because they came running in to grab the possessions. They thought that they were grabbing things that were hefker. Turns out he's got a son, which means that all these possessions belong to the son. We better return it. Okay? But what about if there's an unborn child? Well, the unborn child can't acquire the items. So therefore, if the unborn child can't acquire the items, so they come running in to grab the stuff. Okay, fine. They find out there's an unborn child. They go, great, we'll return it. But then the child is stillborn or dies and there's a miscarriage. Well, then there was never a child, which means why didn't their first acquisition take effect? In reality, the first acquisition was effective, right? So then why didn't it work? Why is the second acquisition more effective than the first one? So
it can acquire without coming to the world, even if it never comes to the world.
So therefore, what we're seeing from here is, right, what we've been presuming is the child can't acquire because he hasn't come into the world, right? So if the child can't acquire because he hasn't come into the world, and he never comes into the world, it means the child is not even relevant to the conversation, which means the first collection, the first time everybody took all the stuff, was effective.
Why did the child was born? Yeah, there's enough help they do, and then a couple seconds later he died.
Oh, okay. So that would be similar to the circumstance that we had with the other son. Once the son exists, he can inherit, then that makes sense. But what we have a challenge with is the case where the child is never alive. Right. You look troubled.
No.
That is a very troubled look.
No.
Isn't inheritance like time bound? So you can push it off a few weeks or a month until.
No, inheritance happens instantaneously.
But let's say if his sons are far away or they're still looking for.
The possessions belong to them. They don't even have to be here to get it, right? So the inheritance is theirs, right? But it's waiting for them to come home to distribute it. That's true. But it belongs, the property belongs to the child. You don't actually need the child there in order for them to inherit.
So the question if it's a viable child born and it's a male, for instance.
That's correct. Then the inheritance, even if it's a female, by the way, right? Even a girl would also inherit, right? So now, the issue is like this. Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to cut.
No, it's good.
The mother, we said before, right? The mother even gets before the daughters in terms of
Let's stick with Yerusha. That's all ksuba stuff.
Right.
This is ksuba stuff. And the ksuba stuff doesn't matter to us.
Is she taken care of? Is there
the ksuba stuff doesn't matter to us right now. Right. We're really worried about the Yerusha side of things. The Yerusha is the real key element. Why? Because if you're going to, who's doing preemptively grabbing the stuff? If everybody came and grabbed, the question is what would happen to the wife? If everybody came and grabbed all the stuff, then the wife is considered to be a prior debtor, prior creditor. She can then go to those people who grabbed all this, right? As long as it's land, it's not movable property, she might not be able to collect from.
That's why I gave the look and I didn't say anything because I knew.
Now, the daitach uber lo kani. Now, if the unborn child isn't able to make an acquisition, lama lahu achzuki b'shniya. Why did you need a second collection? The first collection should have been fine.
Right.
So hachziku lahu chada zimna. They already collected it once. So Amar Rabbi says, I'll tell you why. That's not, Rav Sheshes is incorrect in drawing a conclusion from that case. Why? Because Yerusha haba me'eleha shani. That's like what Rabbi Yossi says. This is inheritance. Remember that the question was, can a child acquire through a present or through a gift, through a present or through a sale or whatever it is, the child's not buying anything, but through a present, can the child acquire while he's not born? There is already an opinion, Rabbi Yossi's opinion already was that a child can inherit something when he's not born yet. So that is what's happening here. That we already know Rabbi Yossi holds that way. So therefore, that is potential answer. Yerusha b'meila shani. This is a Yerusha. That's why the child acts. So Rava gives a different explanation. He says, Shani Hasam, that's a different case. Why? He says, the original acquisition that the people made the first time was very weak. Why? Because when they came in, they made an acquisition, they heard the wife was pregnant. So they kind of had in their mind, we're going to have to give all this stuff back. Well, you can't half acquire something. Either you acquire it or you don't acquire it. It's like we're acquiring it, but we know we're probably giving it all back. Well, if that's your attitude when you acquire, that doesn't count. So therefore, since what the point of the Mishnah is, half acquiring something is not valid. So therefore, when in fact the child dies, then they are going to really make the acquisition, and that's going to be the effective acquisition. The first acquisition is not valid, not because the child did inherit, but because the people who took possession didn't do it full-heartedly. Right? Full-heartedly? Yes, okay. So, my beinayu, what's the practical difference between the two? Ika beinayu, the difference is, shishamu bo shemes velo mes, v'achar kach mes. What happens if, right, there's a circumstance with a son, where they heard that he had a son. Now we've said that acquisition would be meaningless. But they heard the son died. Well, if they heard the son died, now they think the son's dead, but he really didn't die. So now what happens? They went in and they collected and they grabbed everything. Well, they had full force because that's what they thought. Then ultimately the son is miscarriage. There's a miscarriage or whatever, and so now there's no son. So do they have to come back again? Well, according to Rava, the answer is no, because they had a full force acquisition.
Right.
According to Abaye, the answer is yes, because whether they knew the child was alive or not is irrelevant. The child actually acquired the items because an ubar can be, yoresh can be inheriting, the fetus can be inheriting. So that's what the difference of opinion might be.
Right.
Okay. Toshma. Come and listen, new case. Tinok ben yom echad, nochel, there's new proof, right? Nochel umanchel. If you have a child who's 1 day old, that child inherits and can cause a transfer of inheritance, meaning if the child owns property and the child dies, then his heirs inherit his property. How can a child have heirs, right? He doesn't have any kids. Brothers, exactly. His brothers are going to inherit it, right? He can have brothers, right? And he can even have, so he has brothers, right? Paternal brothers inherit. So therefore he's going to he's going to be able to cause an inheritance over to his brothers.
Wouldn't those older brothers inherit before this newborn
child? So this is the, we're going to see circumstances where it's going to make a practical difference, okay? But remember, let's explain it like this, okay? He gets a possession, which, let's say he has two brothers, right? Older brothers, the oldest brother is a Bechor, second brother, third brother is now this baby, okay? The Bechor is going to take a double portion, which means the way that we're going to divide this property is we're going to have 3 kids. We're going to divide it into 4 parts. The firstborn is going to take 2 parts. The second kid and the third kid each get 1 part, okay? Now, this child dies, okay? If the child is non-viable or dies early before 1 day, right? So then there's really only 2 brothers, which means you're going to divide the possessions in thirds, and 2/3 go to the oldest brother. If, however, this youngest child is viable, then the oldest brother only gets half, and then this other portion is now going to get divided between the other 2 brothers who inherit him. So it does make a difference whether he causes inheritance because it reshuffles how much of the property and how much of the estate goes. So it does make a difference. Okay? So now, so Tinok ben Yom Echad, Nochel Manchel. Ben Yom Echad in Ubar Lo. So we're going to try to prove from here that Rav Sheshes is incorrect because it says here clearly that when he's 1 day old, he inherits. But if he's less than a day old, he doesn't, which means that Rav Sheshes is incorrect. An unborn fetus does not inherit. So the answer is, lo, that's not a proof. Hamer Rav Sheshes already answered this. Nochel benichse ha'em lahanchil la'achin mina av. So he says this is what's going on here is that the child is inheriting his mother's possessions. Okay, the mother died during childbirth, and now if the baby inherits, the baby is going to inherit his mother's possessions. The child inherits the mother's possession as well, and now he has brothers, paternal brothers, and so that even though he might, and his paternal brothers might have a different mother. So therefore, the other brothers are not inheriting from his mother who died. He inherits from his mother. But then the baby dies, then he can then transfer the property over to the other brothers. So the other brothers are now going to inherit from his mother because of him, through him. Okay? Now, that rule is Vidavka ben Yom Echad. That's only if the child's 1 day old. About Ubar Lo, but an Uber not. Now, Rav Shesha says an Uber himself is able to inherit. That's not the problem. The problem is he can't transfer that inheritance over to the other brothers, to his paternal brothers, right? Again, we'll say that again, right?
Well, why not?
Great question. My timer. What's the reason why not? Why not? Glad you asked that. So on to Amud Beis. Dehu Mayas Beresha. Why? Because whenever the mother's going to die during childbirth, the mother dies first before the baby. The baby's going to die first before the mother. Okay, what happens? Bein habein yorishes imo bekever lahanchil laachin min ha'av. What happens is that once the offspring has died, you cannot transfer to his brothers through him. What's going on here? Okay, let's say a person has sons, and he dies, and he's going to transfer all of his property to his son. Okay, that's the way that works. Now, let's say the son predeceases the father. When the father dies, the son's children, the grandchildren, inherit the father. Okay, but the father's already died. The answer is it's not relevant. The children of the deceased father can inherit the grandfather through their father, despite the fact that their father already died. Okay, that's how inheritance transfers through the generations. So it goes from the grandfather, there's no father, it goes right down to the grandchildren. Okay, that is not the case when it's being transferred sideways to brothers. If the brother dies before he owns the property, and the property gets transferred to him after he's already dead, it can only go to his kids, but he's one day old, he has no kids. But then it goes to the brothers, it goes sideways to the brothers. But if the child died first, before the mother, right, then the property wouldn't go to the brothers, because he's not present to cause it to inherit. So therefore, the only circumstance when the child can inherit and cause the brothers to inherit is when the child's already born. Before that, if the mother dies, then you can presume the baby was already dead. And since the baby was already dead, the property from the mother isn't going to go to the son, it'll go to the husband. Right? Or it'll go to other heirs. It's not going to go to the son. And not going to go to the son's brothers. Make sense?
Yeah.
I was like, we need like a family tree and a chart here to be able to.
Yeah.
Okay, good. But the bottom line is that's what's going on here. It's not a proof. Not a proof about being able to inherit. Right? It's not a proof that the child's not able to inherit before he's born. It's a proof that the child's not able to transfer property to somebody else before he's born. Okay. Now, Labemra, in order for you to have this statement to be true, you have to be making a presumption. Lamemra dehu mayas beresha. What has to happen is the son has to die before his mother. Okay? So if you have a circumstance where a mother dies while pregnant, how do you know the child died first or the mother died first? So the answer is, you can make a presumption that the child died first.
Or we'll take an X-ray.
Huh?
Or go through an X-ray.
Well, if there's X-rays that are available, but, we're going to see that they're going to ask questions even without an X-ray, maybe that there are circumstances. The hava uvda, there was once a case that they had, upirches tlasa perchuse, the baby was still convulsing after the mother had already died 3 times. So it seemed like the baby was still alive after the mother had already died. So you see that that's practically not the case. And if the baby is still alive, then the brothers can inherit from the baby, from the mother, right? The mother will cause the inheritance to the baby, and then the baby will transfer to the brothers. Why not? So Amar Mar Baravashi, so Mar Baravashi explains, Midi dehavi azanav halata shemefarchasas. This is like a lizard's tail. Meaning, when you cut the tail off the lizard, right? If you've ever been to Florida or whatever, you see the tail of the lizard, they wag around automatically on impulse. It's not a sign of life. It's just involuntary muscle movement. So too, that was what's happening with the fetus. You know that if the mother died in childbirth, the baby has already died, and even though the baby's moving, that's not life. That's just muscle impulse. Mar Breder of Yosef Mishmei de Rava Amar Lomar Shemamait Bechelek Bechora. So he says the second explanation of the case is like what we explained when I explained it before. So Mar, the son of Rav Yosef, explained in the name of Rava that what's happening here is we're explaining that the child who's 1 day old reduces the share of the firstborn son, as we explained when we talked about before. If there's only 2 sons, so then the oldest one is going to take 2/3 of the property. Once there's another child, the 3rd son, the oldest one gets half, and then they're going to divide equally the other brother's portion. That only happens once he's born, right? Why? B'dafka ben yom echad. Only once he's born. Why? Aval ubar. But if he is still a fetus, then his existence is irrelevant. He doesn't get portion number 4 if he is not born yet. It doesn't reduce the amount that the firstborn gets. Why? My time. Why is that? Because the yaldu lo amar Rachmana, the pasuk says that a firstborn's share is diminished when his brother is born. The yaldu lo Rachman. That's what the Torah says. So, the Amar Mar Breder Rav Yosef Mishmei de Rava, as Mar, the son of Rav Yosef, says the name of Rava, Ben Shanola Lachar Misas Av, if you have a child that's born after the father already died, Eino Mamait Bechilek Bechora, so then he does not reduce the amount of the firstborn possession, as he's got his older brother, right? So he doesn't reduce. If he's born, if let's say his mother's pregnant, the father died already before he was born. So then, my taima, why not? So the answer is v'yaldu lo amar Rachmana v'ha leka. So it says because he has to be born at the same time as there's a father, he has to be born. This child has to be born to the father, and there's no father. So therefore, the child being born doesn't reduce the older brother's portion.
So the yaldu is a past tense?
Yes, v'yaldu lo, correct. Right? Yeah. So now Besura Masnu Hachi, the Pumbedisa Masnu Hachi. In Surah they learned it one way, in Pumbedisa they learned another. These are the names of cities that were in Bavel. Along the Euphrates River, right? There were several towns and cities they had yeshivas in. Surah, Pumbedisa, Mechuzah, each of these towns had various yeshivas in it. And so in one yeshiva they learned it one way, and in another yeshiva they learned it differently. Amar Mar Breder of Yosef Mishmei de Rava, that they said that Mar, the son of Rav Yosef, said in the name of Rava, Bechor shenolad liachar misav aviv. If the firstborn son is born after his father dies, eno noto pishnayim, they hold that firstborn doesn't take a double portion. Right? That's different than we learned it before, that the new son that's born doesn't reduce the son's double portion from the same pasuk. My taima, because Yakir Amar Rachmana. Great question. So, and the answer, great answer, right? That the Rashba says, how does it happen? So there's a couple of ways it can happen. Number one is twins, right? They're going to be a firstborn son. He's the Bechor, his younger brother. They both can be born. That's right. If he had 2 wives is the other way it could happen, right? If he has 2 wives, like that. So that's 2, right? That was pretty quick. So he has 2 wives because he can be pregnant because he dies before before the firstborn son is born, right? And then there's another son besides. He has 2 wives, right? He can have 2 women pregnant at the same time. So therefore, that is the circumstance. The Bechor, if he's born after the father dies, doesn't get a double portion, right? Because why? Because the pasuk says Yakir Rachmana v'halei. The father has to be able to recognize him, has to see him. So the father's not alive. He doesn't ever recognize, doesn't ever see him. Okay, v'halesa the Yakir. The hilchasa, the halacha is kekol hani lishni. To Amar Mar Breder of Yosef Mishmei de Rava, both of these things are true. Whether you are in Surah or in Pumbedisa, both of these facts are true. That the child born after the father already died doesn't get double, and a child born after the father already died does not reduce the portion of the firstborn son. Okay, next. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yitzchak says in Rabbi Yochanan, Mezaka le'ubar lo kana. Let's say somebody wants to give a present to his unborn son, like we've been discussing, doesn't work. V'im tomer Mishnah seinu. And now if you're going to say, what about our Mishnah? Our Mishnah seems to imply that it can. Ho'el v'daso shel adam krova eitzel beno. That's different. Why? Because he holds our Mishnah is talking about a son, and a person really has a very close relationship with his son, and therefore he can. Now that's a little bit troubling, right? What is that? What's the relevance? The way we've been describing davar shelo baliolam, the problem of a kinyan is technical. You don't have another person on the other side of a kinyan. The answer is there's a second way to understand davar, that somebody's makna davar shelo baliolam. The answer is that if one of the parties or one of the item doesn't exist, so then the person who's really making the sale can't really mean it. I'm going to sell, I've got this palm tree with fruit. I'll sell you the dates. There's no dates. How serious are you about the sale? Right? So again, it's like we had the case with the convert, where he comes in and he believes there's a son, so you don't really make an acquisition because you really think there's some other things that are going to happen. Same thing at davar shelo bo li'olam. You don't know the son even exists. You don't need the other party even exists. How serious can you really be about this transaction? But says Rabbi Yitzchak that when it comes to his son, since he really, really is looking forward to having a son, it can work. So that's a unique case. You really can't transfer property over to an unborn child, but if it's your son, you can. That's what he says. Amar li Shmuel Rav Chana Bagdata. So Shmuel said to Rav Chana from Baghdad. Baghdad was a city, the Rasham says a city at that time as well. That city was on the Tigris, or along the Tigris River, and almost like the two rivers run parallel through Persia, right? So that Baghdad was there. It was probably where Baghdad is today. So Puk Aisile Be'asara, go get for me 10 guys together. The Eimar Lach Be'apaihu. And I like what you just said. I want to be able to announce that publicly, that this is the halacha. Hamazaka Ubar Kana. I'd like to be able to make the announcement that if you are going to transfer over your possessions to an unborn child, it works. But the hilchos of the halacha is Hamazaka Ubar Lo Kana. That is in fact not the halacha. If you transfer property over to an unborn child, it does not work. Okay, next. Hahuda Amar Lidavisu Nichsai Libni Diyahavu Liminech. So let's say a person says to his wife, so I want to be able to transfer my property over to my son that I'm going to have from you. Okay, so also break Kashisha. So he has the oldest. So then what happens is this is his second wife, right? So he wants to be able to say, you know what, I'm so happy to be married to you. I want all my possessions to go to your kids. Okay. Problem is he's got a son from his first marriage. He's not so happy about that. So he comes along. So also break Kashisha, the older son comes along. Amar le hahu gavra maiti havi ale. He said, what about me? Why are you going to leave me out of why are you writing me out of the will? What did I do? So it is jealousy, right? So Amar le. So he says, Zilkani kechad mi bra. So he says, you're right. You'll take like one of the other kids. You're in, like everybody else, like all the rest of the kids. Okay. So now, Hanach vaday lo kanu. That statement isn't going to work. There's a problem with the statement. He's transferring property to unborn children that don't exist. Now, his wife's not even pregnant in this case. So this is even worse than all the cases that we've had in the past, right? Where we had the wife being pregnant, at least we were trying to figure out whether you can transfer to an unborn child. The wife's not even pregnant, says, I'm going to give it to all your kids. Well, that is a meaningless statement. You can't give anything over. The question is, right, Dakasi Leisnu, they don't exist. So hi is cholik litlaya b'makom benaya, o leis le cholik litlaya b'makom benaya. He says, but the question is like this. He made a statement that had two parts to it. Or did he really make one statement? The statement was, you will inherit my possessions just like the other kids. Okay? So has he, or I'm going to give you all my, it was a give, right? What did he say? Nichsai, my possessions belong. So he's actually giving them now. So did he transfer his possessions over to the other son through this statement? So you look at it like this. The first part of his statement was meaningless because he doesn't have the other kids. Hence, the entire statement is meaningless. We just throw the whole thing out and it has no meaning. Or do we say, well, the first part of his statement was meaningless, but the second part could be meaningful. And so maybe his son really does own all of his possessions. So now, Rabbi Abin, Rabbi Maisha, Rabbi Yirmiyah, to Omri, they say like this. Is cholik l'toya b'makom benaya? So they all said that we can divide this up, that we can be able to give this, that we can give this to the son. Then Rabbi Yavo, Rabbi Chanina, Bar Papi, Rabbi Yitzchak, Nafcha, Omri, leis cholik l'toya b'makom benaya. He says you cannot, right? So he says okay. So Amar le Rabbi Yavo, Rabbi Yirmiyah. So Rabbi Yavo, who was on one side of this argument, came over to Rabbi Yirmiyah on the other side of the argument, and he says, Hilchasa kavasan or holichasa kavasaichu. Who's the halacha like, me or you? Right? Who's the halacha like? At the end of the day, we both have an opinion on this matter, but are we right or are you right? So Amar le, so he answered him back, Shita de Hilchasa kavasan. He says clearly the halacha is like us. right? Says, why? What makes you so sure you're right? Dikashishna minaychu. We're older than you guys. The two groups of rabbis, we were the older rabbis, you're the newer rabbis. So therefore, the halacha must be like us. We're older, we're wiser, and hence the halacha is like us. Okay. But the halacha is not like you guys, the dardiki awesome. You're like school children, right? You're like this. So you're not in the ball game. So Amar Lei, so he answered him back. Midi because shishusa talya milsa. Does it matter how old you are in order to determine what the halacha is? That what it matters? Whoever's older wins. But taima talya milsa. It depends who's got the better reasoning, the better rational argument. So v'taima mai. So he says, okay, great. What's your reason? You think your reasoning's better, so therefore you win. What's the reason why you're right? So he said, Zil gabi de Rabbi Abin de asbarte nihale. Go ask Rabbi Abin. He was one of the rabbis that's on your side. I went over to him already. I explained it to him, and he switched sides to my view. So I already explained it to Rabbi Abin, and he is on my side now. V'karchish bereishay. So he nodded at me. He said, "Oh, that's a good point." I explained my reason, and he gave me a nod and said, "Okay, you're right." So he says, in the base medrash, Ozil legabe. So we went to go ask Rabbi Abin, what happened? What was the explanation? I'm curious now. What made you change your mind? So he says, Amar lei, ilu amar lei. Let's say a person made the following statement. Let's say he says, if a person said, Kni kechamor mikani. Let's say a person said, you should acquire this item like a donkey. Does that statement have any meaning? You can't give ownership of something to a donkey. The statement of, here donkey, have it, is meaningless. So when you make a statement here, acquire this like a donkey, does that statement mean anything? De'itmar kani kachamor lo kana. So he says, okay, so that doesn't work. So now what happens if when he says, you should accept it like a donkey is not, at v'chamor. Now what happens if he says, so that's what happens, that's what he says, that's basically the statement that he was making. You're going to acquire my property just like my other sons. Well, the other sons can't acquire anything. Hence the statement about that other son acquiring is also meaningless. That was why his logic was good, and that's why Rabbi Abin changed his mind. Okay, next case. What happens if he says, at v'chamor? You should acquire it and also my donkey. Okay, so now those are really, they can be statements that are separated out. Okay, so do we separate the statement out? How does this work? So Rav Nachman Amar, so we'll start with Rav Nachman's view. Rav Nachman looks at it, he says, Kana mechza. He says, you know what happens? The donkey part is meaningless. So half the goods, there's no kinyan on. The other half, that works. So the person acquires half of the items, right? You and the donkey should acquire. You should acquire and the donkey should acquire. The donkey doesn't get anything. You get half. Perfect. That's what Rav Nachman says. For Rav Hamnuna Amar, Rav Hamnuna's view is, Lo Amar Klum. That statement is meaningless. You and the donkey. That means you tied the two things together. You made the transaction similar. Just like the donkey doesn't acquire, you don't either. Okay? And third, for Rav Sheshes, Rav Sheshes' view is Kana Hakol. Then the person gets everything.
That's what I was going to say. It would make sense.
Why? I'm curious to know, because I did not understand this for a long time.
Well, I mean, if I left money for two kids.
Yes.
I don't want to say.
Right. A person left money for two kids.
Right. And one of the kids passed away. It's not logical that the other kid acquires everything.
Great. And that is an accurate explanation for the Gemara. But that eluded me for some time. And here's why. Because when it comes to an inheritance, how does inheritance work? When a father dies and he passes on his inheritance to his children, what he's doing is he passes on all of his possessions to all of his children.
Right.
All that's missing is they've got to divide it up into equal shares. But really, all of them are partners in the possessions. And that is, in fact, what Rav Sheshes is claiming is going on here. When a person gives over an object to two people, why is it that each person takes half? It's not that when I give it to you, you get half. When I give it to you, you get half. It's that when I give it to you and you both become co-owners in the object. Well, you both can't walk away with the object. You've got to take half and you've got to take half.
Right.
So therefore you split it. That's why you get half and you get half.
Right.
But I'm really transferring the entire object to both of you simultaneously.
Right.
That's what Rav Sheshes is going on. When you say you and the donkey, so I'm transferring the entire object to you and I'm transferring the entire object to the donkey. Well, the transference to the donkey is meaningless. Hence,
it's all yours.
You get the whole thing. That's what happens, right? So that is how Rav Sheshes looks at it. It bothered me for a while, but right away. Okay. Yes.
When you transfer your estate to children,
yes.
does it not include the debt that
Does.
you incurred?
Yeah, well, yeah, the answer is, I don't know if it's included in the estate or whether there is a debt that, and all of the liens travel with the property, yes. But now,
Car debt or whatever.
yes, but now here's there is a practical difference between the times of the Gemara and modern times. In the times of the Gemara, all of that occurred when on tangible property. Always there's a lien on a piece of land or on a house or something like that. But I can't really put a lien on your monetary property. From the times of the Gemara afterwards, and the Jewish people were no longer living in one place, and the Jewish people already at that point had been exiled and living, and the land ownership was already something the Muslims were prohibiting Jews from having. Jews were pretty liquid, and their main assets were money. And so therefore, at that point, there was even the ability to collect debts from movable items. So therefore, you could actually collect from the bank accounts of the estate, right? But the Gemara, when we're going to learn the Gemara is never going to talk like that. The Gemara always considers movable assets to be much less, that you can't put a lien on movable property so easily. Okay? Okay. So Amar of Sheshas. Rav Shesha says, we have the last couple of minutes, Mina Allah. Where do I get my proof from? The Tanya in a Brisa. Rav Yossi says, Ein lecha mar bekishos ella pnimi shabo. Leficha keshu torem mosif ala chitzon shabo v'torem. He says, let's say I'm giving truma to a Kohen. So the halacha is that I am not supposed to give the Kohen bad stuff. I've got all these very, very delicious, he says, kishus, there are gourds or melons of some kind. Okay, the outside is very sweet. The inner part is more bitter. Okay, so what you're not supposed to do is say, well, the outside is mine and the bitter stuff, that's what I'm going to give to the Kohen. That's not what you're supposed to do. So what you're supposed to do is you give, if I have 50 melons and I'm going to give 1/50th, so I'm going to keep 49 melons and 1 melon is going to be the Kohen's. That way, the sweet part on the outside corresponds to the sweet parts that I'm keeping. And the bitter part in the middle is going to be corresponding to the bitter part that I'm keeping. Okay. The problem is, not all of the melons are all the same size. It's possible that the melon that I'm giving to the Kohen has more bitter in it than sweet compared to the other melons. Therefore, the advice is add a little bit of extra sweet parts so you cover your bases. That's what the suggestion is. So now, amai, why should that be? At v'chamorhu. This is a circumstance where the truma that you give is bad. But when you make the decision that you're going to give bad plus good, so then it should be that if what you're saying is true, so then the truma shouldn't be valid. Why is it that the truma is valid? It must be that, as we described, when you make the transference of at v'chamor, the transaction actually does work. Okay, that makes sense? Okay, so we'll go over this. We'll go over it again tomorrow. So just to be able to finish up because we're going to daven. So the answer is, so shani hosam, that's different. That's different. Why? To be doraisa truma ma'aisehi. Really, this concept of being able to give on bad for good, of not being able to give bad for good, that's only a rabbinic enactment. Really, the Torah allows you to do that. You only have to give 50% of produce. As long as the produce is produce, you can actually give that to it. It's just not good practice. So the rabbis came along and said you can't do it. But the reason it works is because truma is you can't compare truma to other transactions. Other transactions, maybe that wouldn't work. But when it comes to truma, that transaction does work because how do I know that if I do violate this rabbinic enactment that the truma is in fact valid truma? You should give good. Why? Because you should not bear any sin when you give over truma. So if the truma isn't valid, so nesias chet lama, he says that the truma is just not valid. He just didn't accomplish anything. So it must be mikan l'tor minarel yafish truma. So truma must be that the truma is valid. It's just not a good way to do it. The Torah says you're a sinner, and then so the rabbi said, "Don't do that." Okay, we'll stop here, and we'll just quickly review this last piece tomorrow when we get started. But that is a good place for us to stop.
Yeah.
Now.